All right, hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the Big Three on CPA TV. My name is Mihir Torsekar, and as always, I am joined by my co-host and fellow economist Andrew Rechenberg. And today we're going to be talking to you all about the big three topics that are on our mind concerning international trade. But before we get to it, I just wanted to give you a preview up front of what we're going to be talking about. So right off the bat, China earlier this week announced that they wanted to make the renminbi a world reserve currency as part of their efforts to try to de-dollarize the world, try to reduce dependence of the world on the US dollar. And we can talk about, in the show why that's so critical for China. I mean, they understand the importance of leverage and choke points and things like that. They've certainly deployed that playbook when it comes to global trade, racking up a $1.2 trillion surplus. And so the one advantage we have in any negotiations with China or any other adversary is the world's dependence on the US dollar. So we'll get into that. The next issue we want to talk about is the announcement by the Export-Import Bank and the White House about an initiative called Project Vault, which is an attempt to try to wean themselves away from dependence on China for critical minerals. And these are the types of materials that are intrinsic or essential to the production of anything from consumer electronics to military applications. And China has a pretty strong grip on critical minerals refining and mining as well. They mine about 70% of the world's rare earth materials and refine about 90% of it. So we want to try to remove our dependence on China, and it's going to be extremely important for us as part of our reindustrialization strategy in the United States going forward. And for the third point, I want to turn it over to Andrew and have him talk a little bit about that.
For the third topic this week, we have a new poll that just came out on solar energy, where we found that Trump supporters actually support solar energy as part of the initiative for energy in the U.S., with 68% agreeing with the statement that we need all forms of electricity generation, including utility solar, to be built to lower electricity costs. And we'll talk about this more in the show, but I think that this gives a real good preview for how the energy conversation is shifting in the United States. And especially for Trump voters, it's not so much about renewables or lower carbon emissions or anything like that, but everyone is seeing electricity costs go up, and there's a broad support for an all-of-the-above energy solution for the U.S., and we'll get more into that in the show. So let's get started.
All right, so the first topic on the agenda today is the announcement recently that China wants the renminbi to be officially in that vaunted category of global reserve currency status. Now, this comes off the heels of a pretty systemic campaign to try to what we could call de-dollarize the world and try to reduce the world's dependence on the U.S. dollar. So, of course, the U.S. dollar has a fabled kind of reputation and it's sort of indispensable for any kind of transactions that are conducted globally. Most financial transactions are conducted in dollars. Commodities are priced in U.S. dollars, and so the dollar it gives the United States a certain amount of leverage for example, imposing financial sanctions, which we've done with increasing regularity as we've contended with various, conflicts, whether it's Iran, Russia. And so it's clear, China has made it very clear that they are very focused on obtaining or getting control of choke points, which are strategic points in whether it's the supply chain or anything that gives them leverage to be able to, apply that or weaponize that against their foes. So they've obviously done that recently with the rare earths technologies, which they have essentially weaponized by imposing export controls. And, they understand that they are, of course, integral into the supply chains of, really anything, defense applications, consumer electronics, because of that chokehold that they have on critical minerals. And so that's just one example of how China has weaponized that and used their leverage. But now they're trying to go into the financial space where the United States has domain or has dominance over that domain. And yeah, I think it's worth questioning, how realistic do we think this is? So Andrew, I want to turn that over to you and see what you think about it. I mean, I have my thoughts, but I want to hear what you think about how realistic, how credible a threat this is.
Yeah, I think that this really reflects a change in China's thinking in a sense that global geopolitics is really changing in the past few years and will change in the next few. I think China has traditionally been wanting to have a very low value of their currency to promote exports and really build their manufacturing industry, but their manufacturing industry is really advanced and really stable at this point. And if anything, they have a huge global hold, almost a monopoly on some of these critical inputs and industries. And so I think that they're becoming less reliant on a low renminbi value. And this has caused them to actually, over the past few years, allow a slight gradual appreciation of the renminbi in general terms, and especially against the US dollar. And I think that this also reflects a need for China for wanting them to have a stable domestic financial situation and to protect some of their external access. So if they have to sell any of their facilities or their investments overseas, that they still have a stable return for that renminbi. And this is a result of their huge trade surpluses. But I think that in the short term, this really isn't as much of a huge threat. I think China wants to start heading in this direction, especially after seeing the U.S. sanctions and financial control against Russia, and they don't want to be controlled or limited by any sort of measures like that. And so they do want to have a more multipolar world currency situation where the Chinese currency is one of many reserve currencies. But I think in the short term, this is definitely a long ways off. As far as total global reserve currencies as of late 2025, the US dollar is still very much in the lead with number one with 57% of global reserves. This is down from 71% that was the case in 2000. So it has been a big drop, but the second runner-up is still very far behind. The second runner-up is the euro, which is only at 20%, and the renminbi itself is still below 2% of global financial reserves. So they have a long ways to go. This isn't something that's going to be kicking in tomorrow or even in the next few years, but it is a change of direction.
Yeah, in the end, too, what makes the United States such a unique participant in financial markets is the fact that we have open capital accounts, deep and trusted financial markets, and the ability for investors to make and move money without political risk. And so those are the kinds of conditions that are just simply absent from China. And if they were to be serious about moving towards, reserve currency status of any sort, to have any credibility in that argument, at a minimum, they would have to do those things like lift capital controls and allow capital to move freely. But doing that risks a lot of volatility in their currency. Their currency would very likely rise concomitantly with their trade surpluses, which is what's supposed to happen in a normal functioning system. So, that's something, as you talked about it early on, they, part of their strategy right now is to export their way towards growth. And what helps them export is the fact that their currency has been undervalued. It's worked as sort of a hidden subsidy for them because they don't have the consumer market in place to be able to absorb all that. Well, actually, they do, but they're not willing to unleash it through fiscal policy and things like that. It's a big mess over there. So yes, to your point, we'll just leave it there. I think you're right that they are a ways away, but one thing we have learned in our time looking at China and how they operate, you cannot take your eye off the ball. And there are so many industries where we have once been in the lead on something, had a dominant, commanding lead, looked away, and then all of a sudden, 25, 30 years later, China is right there, in the leadership position. So there's something to keep an eye on. Second topic of the show is the recent announcement by the Export-Import Bank and the White House about Project Vault, which is essentially a $12 billion initiative to try to encourage the collection of, a stockpile of rare earths and critical minerals to try to, kind of wean ourselves away from the dependence that we have on China. So, for rare earths, these are, there's critical minerals that the U.S. Geological Survey has identified as important for national security. And, there's the process of both mining it to acquire the raw ore and then refining it, which is the process that turns it into a usable material that can then be used for downstream products like, consumer electronics, but most notably defense applications, missiles, and things of that nature. And China, from way back in 1992, announced that the Middle East has oil and we will have rare earths. And so they've charted this course methodically over the years to get to this point where they have a stranglehold on the refining of critical minerals, especially rare earths. So I think this is an excellent initiative for us to be able to begin taking this seriously. Beginning in 2010, China has used and sort of weaponized their leverage that they had over, rare earths in a spat that they had with Japan. And Japan responded by stockpiling critical minerals. And over the past, 15 years or so, they have reduced their dependence on China from like something like 90% to like 60%, something in that range, right? So it's possible to begin to, wean yourself away from China. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. But Andrew, obviously, I want to turn it over to you and hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think that this has a lot of potential to wean us off of China for our really, really tragic critical minerals reliance on China. And I think that this is a great positive first sign. But I do see two different directions that this sort of program could go. One that could be very effective in loosening this reliance, but another one that would be a lot more muted. And if this does take the approach of really just trying to short term get a massive stockpile of critical minerals in the short term, this is going to be still reliant on China unless specific restrictions are put in place. So we don't want to just have to get a huge stockpile up in the next year or two because there really isn't enough domestic production to get them in the US in that short of a time span. So I wouldn't want this to be a short-term project. And also, it does concern me that this has been compared to, for example, the U.S. Strategic Oil Reserve. And the U.S. Strategic Oil Reserve, while it sounds like that is a fantastic idea, it's really not that substantial when you look at how much is actually in that reserve. When you take what is currently in the reserve and compare that to current import levels, you really only have 47 days supply that would replace all of our oil imports. And so if it really is following along the lines of the U.S. Strategic Oil Reserve and we just have a little over a month's supply, then I really don't think this program is going to do too much. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have potential. I think that there's a really positive direction that this could take as a long-term demand signal for making and refining critical minerals here in the U.S. or in allied countries. And so if you take this long-term approach and have this constant demand signal for any new suppliers that are willing to pop up in the U.S. or Europe or other allies, then I think this could be a fantastic program and a great incentive to get us off of Chinese supply.
That's a great point you mentioned about the demand signal, because I think that's really important here, especially when it comes to mining in that sector. Because one thing China has understood all along is that if they can dominate a sector, they can control the price point. So they've basically flooded the market, and they've created such a disincentive for investment. Because why would you invest? If prices are plummeting for mining or for rare earths, what is the business proposition for some of these for-profit companies who are going to say, like, well, we're not going to make money if we're going to be trying to open a mine for a commodity that's falling in price. So by some of the moves that the Pentagon has been making, the White House has been making, is to try to establish a price floor so you can guarantee investment incentives to keep that investment consistent and steady. And yeah, I think it's also an important question of, I like that you made the reference to the petroleum reserve, which dates back to the 1973 Arab oil embargo, which sort of, similar situation where geopolitical ructions kind of occasioned this policy move to try to prepare ourselves and to try to, kind of prevent ourselves from being in a vulnerable position. But, the parallels are apt, but in the same thing that you mentioned, the concern here would be like, okay, so you're able to acquire all this material, these inputs. Who's going to be doing the refining? Because if China's still refining 90% of those minerals, are we really reducing our dependence? And so these are important questions that we have to ask. We really have to think about, where are the weak points in the supply chain and really start that process of building it up. And it has to be sustained across administrations. You can't just have the next administration that comes in and just simply abandons the focus or loses focus on that. So overall, though, I'd say good step in the right direction. I'm glad we're taking this issue seriously. Frankly, I think we've neglected it for too long. So better late than never, as they say. So we'll see what happens with that. On to the third item, Andrew, I'll let you talk about this. Go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, so there's a new poll that just came out on polling Trump supporters on their support for solar energy. And while this poll found that not a majority supports solar energy as a renewable energy source or to reduce carbon emissions, of course, this is traditionally not a position taken by Trump or a lot of the Republican Party, but they do support solar energy by a wide margin. 68% support the statement, we need all forms of electricity generation, including utility solar, to be built to lower energy costs. And I think this really reflects a shift in the dynamic of how a lot of Americans think about electricity. And of course, you have people on both sides concerned about having renewable energy and green technology, but I think that for a lot of these Trump supporters, they are very willing to support solar energy or other forms of renewal under the umbrella of basically an all of the above energy approach. We need to have oil, natural gas, we need to have solar, we need to have nuclear power. They want all of these sort of electricity options because we're seeing huge increases in electricity prices. Electricity has been one of the main causes of CPI inflation over the past year. It is much, much more influential than any of the goods that we've seen prices rising over the past year, and is already at the level of rising 6.7% for electricity prices over the past 12 months. And this is a substantial increase. And a lot of this does have to do with increased demand from data centers and AI, but just with all this new demand, you need more supply of the energy as well. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of Americans realize, is that we need to really explore all different energy options, and solar is very much a part of that equation. Solar energy has come a long way in the past few decades, and it's become a very efficient form of energy. And especially if we can be building solar panels here in the US, that guarantees a new form of actual independent domestic US supply of energy. And if we're building panels here in the US, putting up here in the US, that is one of the most independent forms of electricity generation you can get. And it's become very, very efficient. And so I think with all these rising electricity costs, a lot of Americans are realizing that. And higher electricity costs don't just affect everyone in their home. That's a big part of the equation. But energy costs are also essential for making manufacturing and production cheaper here in the US. Higher energy costs ricochet across the board and make everything in life more expensive. And so I think that's really the direction we're seeing this going.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you do polling of different constituency groups and different clusters of Americans, I think it's probably reasonable to assume that they're all going to converge on the same assumption that they don't want to pay more for utilities or for anything. I mean, I think it's widely understood that there's a cost of living crisis that is befalling us. I mean, electricity costs alone, if we just zero in on that specific issue, it's way outpacing inflation. There's been a systemic and kind of chronic underinvestment in transmission and generation of the grid. And it comes at a terrible time right now, of course, where you mentioned the AI data centers that are coming up. A lot of the states that are, or cities that are near data centers, are witnessing dramatic increases in their electricity costs. And it absolutely behooves us, to consider all the options that we have available to us. So, if you look at China, for example, and we talk about the competitiveness of the AI industry, and we talk a lot about hardware and who's making what chips and who's ahead in that race and things like that. We don't talk enough about like the energy. If you have the hardware, that's great. But if you don't have the energy to power those data centers or to, apply those chips or, use those chips constructively, then you're really not going to get ahead in the AI race. And China, alone has installed like 360 gigawatts of renewable energy to go along with all of the coal that they're, consuming in order to build these data centers and try to outcompete us. So we are really shooting ourselves in the foot when we have, all of this investment that came in under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act, and all of these investments. If we just simply mothball them, we're really leaving a lot on the table, and it's really unfortunate to see that. So I agree with you. I think we absolutely need to go all in on all the different forms of electricity that we can do, or that we can go with, to try to reduce the cost of electricity, and I think that'll go a long way for reindustrialization, and just do a lot to help ameliorate the woes of the associated with the affordability crisis. So I think, hey, great show. I think we covered a lot of ground today, as always, but I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap up. So I think next week we'll be back, and we'll be talking about the next big 3 topics that are on our mind. But until then, be well and take care. Thank you.